as I listened to a recent podcast of a discussion between the writer Richard Powers and Ezra Klein of the New York Times. Powers reminded me of the etymology of the word religion. The root of the word ligio is shared with ligament, meaning a connection or a bond. Religio means to reconnect, to tie back together. Religion is a synonym for retying and reconnection. Our communal practices of Judaism involve tying and retying of ourselves to each other, to our covenant, to a shared past and future. The joy of renewing ties, of reconnection, suffused our recently concluded high holiday season. If you were able to be with us in person for worship, despite our masks, we rejoiced in reuniting with one another and in rejoining our voices together in prayer. It was so uplifting to sing together. Our reconnecting with one another was intertwined with our reconnecting to the land of our campus, this expansive sanctuary where so many of us had not gathered together for services in a very long time. As a relative newcomer to Beth Am, who grew up in a colder and more urban environment, the experience of praying in our outdoor chapel is consistently revelatory. The beauty of the surroundings inspires meditation. The diverse flora and the presence of birds and breezes during our worship deepens a sense of wonderment and an understanding of our prayers that praise creation. One of our final outdoor evening services during this season coincided with Simchat Torah. Our practice of beginning once again of rereading the first 5 books of the Bible is an annual act of retying ourselves to Torah. This week, we start again the story of Abraham and Sarah, who respond to God's call to go forth from Babylonia and into the land of Canaan, the land that God will show them. Forgive me, I'm finding the echo. Can you hear me better now? Can you hear? How's that? No, not any better. I'm sorry. This week we start again the story of Abraham and Sarah, who respond to God's call to go forth from Babylonia and into the land of Canaan, the land that God will show them. After this season, when we worshiped outside in tents, when I reread this portion, I took particular note of the details of Abraham and Sarah's outdoor worship. As we do in our outdoor chapel, Abraham and Sarah engage in worship by large trees. And when they camped at the terebinths, or large oak trees of Morrison, an outdoor worship site where Abraham will build an altar, God appears to him and promises, "L'zarecha eten et ha'aretz hazot." I will give to your offspring this land. The promise of land and its dispossession from the Canaanites motivates much of the story of Abraham, and the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites is an overarching theme of the Torah. Biblical writers conceptualize the relationship between the Israelites and Canaan as a land grant. God grants the land of Canaan to the Israelites as a condition of covenantal loyalty. The land belongs to God, and the Israelites may dwell peacefully in this land for as long as they observe the terms of God's covenant. If they break the covenant, they will be expelled from the land, which is how biblical and rabbinic writers retrospectively theologize the Babylonian exile. Because they did not follow the laws of the covenant, God used the Babylonian army as an implement of punishment and to remove the Israelites from the land. From an earlier generation of Beth Am congregants, we have been granted this beautiful land of our campus. Often, as I look out towards the Los Altos Hills from the Biman, our outdoor chapel, I imagine what they looked like before the construction of the homes and buildings that are now part of the landscape. And during this past high holiday season, I began to wonder, who dwelled on our land before we did? I posed this question to our executive director, Rachel Tash, who dutifully went to the bank that holds the security deposit box where we keep the original deed of trust that was signed on July 3rd, 1958, by the then president of our congregation, Fred Neustatter. You might be interested to know that Beth Am's land, its original 9 acres, were purchased for $48,500 from Henry and Martha Worrell. Our land, like much of Los Altos Hills, was once part of Rancho La Purísima Concepción, 4,436 acres granted to Jose Gorgonio and his son Jose Ramon in 1840. They then sold this land to Juana Briones de Miranda in 1844 for the sum of $300. Jose Gorgonio and Jose Ramon were Ohlone Native Americans. In the 18th century, as many of you know, more than 50 villages and tribes of the Ohlone existed in the Bay Area, and the Puishon Tamian Ohlone-speaking people were likely the original inhabitants of what is now Beth Am's campus. This week, in our Torah portion, we reread a story of Abraham and Sarah camping in the land of the Canaanites. In a week in which we observed in the secular calendar what is still called in some states Columbus Day, but here in California is known as Indigenous Peoples Day, we are rereading the first chapter of a long biblical story of promised land and its dispossession from its native peoples. Our Jewish past has taught us what it means to lose one's land, to be persecuted, and of the challenges intrinsic to minority religions and cultures. The Holocaust and its after effects should engender in us empathy for other peoples who suffer from the multi-generational impact of the trauma of displacement and oppression. We, of course, were not responsible for the treatment of indigenous peoples in California at the hands of Europeans and of 19th century Americans who were fueled by their belief in manifest destiny. But as I have said before, we Reformed Jews do not avert our eyes from painful truths. When confronted with new knowledge, we reassess our understandings of the past and accordingly change our actions. And it is these ligatures, these connections between this week and between the Jewish past and American history, between Monday's holiday and this foundational chapter of our story of Abraham and Sarah going forth from their native land to a land that God will show them. These connections of time and text prompt me to note, increasingly, institutions in the Bay Area are adopting a practice known as land acknowledgement, a formal statement or ritual that recognizes and respects indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of the land and of the enduring relationship that exists between indigenous peoples and, in our case, the land on which we, the Beth Am community, now prays, works, and learns. So I ask you, should we adopt this practice? And if so, in what manner should we as a synagogue community express our recognition and respect for the present-day Muwekma Ohlone tribe, which comprises all of the known surviving American Indian lineages aboriginal to the San Francisco Bay Area. In the weeks ahead, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this issue, as these are questions that I'm going to pose to our board. When God commands Abraham to go, Lech Lecha, God promises him, V'heyeh bracha, V'avarecha mevarechecha, V'nivrechu v'cha, Kol mishpachot ha'adamah. You shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and all the families of the earth shall bless themselves through you. There's a ton of blessing in those two verses. 4 times we encounter the verb barach, to bless. But also, in these divine words spoken to Abraham, is the implication of shared blessing and shared fates. V'nivrechu v'cha, kol mishpachot ha'adamah. All of the families of the earth, or of the land, will be blessed b'cha, through you. But b'cha could also mean with you. We are the inheritors of the blessing promised to Abraham and Sarah. We are stewards of this blessing. But we are also stewards of this land. And by reconnecting ourselves to our shared fate with all of the families connected to this land, to these 9 acres, then we too, like Sarah, like Abraham, may become a blessing and may also be blessed. Shabbat Shalom.